Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that seems too small to care about. Literally. Was Napoleon Bonaparte really short? You know the meme, right? The tiny general stomping around Europe, overcompensating for his size by conquering half the continent. It's one of those stories that gets repeated so much that people forget to check if it's even true. So dim the lights, grab some water or that questionable herbal tea that probably expired last year, and let's sink slowly into this tale. A story about one man, his empire, his questionable family life, and of course, his alleged height problem. Spoiler, the answer is not exactly what your high school teacher told you. But then again, when did your high school teacher ever get through Napoleon without turning it into a sleep aid anyway? Let's take it slow. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, which at the time had just been taken over by France. So technically, he was French. But if you want to annoy a Corsican, try saying that out loud. His family belonged to the minor nobility, which is a nice way of saying they had a title but not much else. His father, Carlo, was basically a lawyer who moonlighted as a wannabe aristocrat. His mother, Letizia, was tough, practical, and ended up raising a small army of her own, 13 children, though only 8 survived childhood, which honestly wasn't bad for the 18th century. From the start, Napoleon had a chip on his shoulder. Imagine being the second son of a not very rich noble family, shipped off to France to attend school. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent, got mocked for it, and had classmates who thought he was provincial and awkward, which he kind of was. He wasn't the charming extrovert type. He was intense. He read history obsessively, loved math more than sports, and was the sort of teenager who argued about Julius Caesar at the dinner table. Not exactly prom king material. But this is where the legend of his shortness starts to form, because Napoleon was often described as looking different and feeling different from those around him. And when people wanted to mock him later, it was easy to latch on to that idea. Here was this little Corsican outsider pretending to be a big French hero.
Let's pause for a moment. Was he actually short? By the numbers, when Napoleon died in 1821, British doctors measured his body. They recorded his height as 5 feet 2 inches, which sounds tiny to modern ears, but wait. This was French measurement, not the English one. French inches, or pouces, were larger than British inches. Translate that, and you get around 5 feet 6 or 7 in today's terms. So he was perfectly average for a Frenchman of his time. Not a giant, sure, but not unusually short either. Just normal. The problem is, the British hated Napoleon, and propaganda loves exaggeration. So cartoonists in London started drawing him as this angry, pint-sized dictator being carried around like a child. They mocked him endlessly, painting him as a cranky toddler trying to take over the sandbox of Europe. And once you put a joke into a cartoon, good luck getting rid of it. People believed the myth, repeated it, and by the time the 20th century rolled around, short Napoleon was basically common knowledge. In reality, Napoleon was probably taller than some of his guards, who were famously chosen for their big hats and imposing presence. You stand next to a 6-foot grenadier in a furry bearskin cap, and suddenly you look small. That didn't help his reputation. But let's float over to his personality, because height isn't the only thing that made people think of Napoleon as small. He had what you might call a concentrated energy. He walked fast, talked fast, worked constantly, and didn't waste time with small talk. His temper could flare quickly and then vanish just as quickly. He demanded loyalty, and he micromanaged everything, from battle plans down to his wife's wardrobe. So when critics accused him of having a Napoleon complex, trying to act big because he was small, it was really more about his personality than his height. He wasn't compensating for being short. He was compensating for being Napoleon, which is a much larger problem. Let's pause for a moment. Was he actually short? By the numbers, when Napoleon died in 1821, British doctors measured his body. They recorded his height as 5 feet 2 inches, which sounds tiny to modern ears. But wait, this was French measurement, not the English one. French inches, or pouces, were larger than British inches. Translate that, and you get around 5 feet 6 or 7 in today's terms. So he was perfectly average for a Frenchman of his time. Not a giant, sure, but not unusually short either. Just normal. The problem is, the British hated Napoleon, and propaganda loves exaggeration. So cartoonists in London started drawing him as this angry, pint-sized dictator being carried around like a child. They mocked him endlessly, painting him as a cranky toddler trying to take over the sandbox of Europe. And once you put a joke into a cartoon, good luck getting rid of it. People believed the myth, repeated it, and by the time the 20th century rolled around, short Napoleon was basically common knowledge. In reality, Napoleon was probably taller than some of his guards, who were famously chosen for their big hats and imposing presence. You stand next to a 6-foot grenadier in a furry bearskin cap, and suddenly you look small. That didn't help his reputation. But let's float over to his personality, because height isn't the only thing that made people think of Napoleon as small. He had what you might call a concentrated energy. He walked fast, talked fast, worked constantly, and didn't waste time with small talk. His temper could flare quickly and then vanish just as quickly. He demanded loyalty, and he micromanaged everything, from battle plans down to his wife's wardrobe. So when critics accused him of having a Napoleon complex, trying to act big because he was small, it was really more about his personality than his height. He wasn't compensating for being short. He was compensating for being Napoleon, which is a much larger problem.
Let's get cozy with a few details of his personal life. Napoleon's love life was messy and often tragic-comic. He married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow with 2 children, who was charming, stylish, and had social connections Napoleon badly needed. He adored her. She adored Paris fashion. They both cheated on each other. She had lovers while he was off conquering Italy. He took mistresses when he found out. The letters he wrote to her are painfully clingy, like, "Please don't wash yourself before I get there," clingy. Yes, that's a real quote. Romantic in a 18th century hygiene sort of way. Eventually, Napoleon divorced her because she couldn't produce an heir. He then married Marie Louise of Austria, who was 18 years old when he was 40. Awkward, but politically convenient. She did produce an heir, the King of Rome, who sadly died young. Napoleon wanted a dynasty. What he got instead was a handful of mistresses, a bitter ex-wife, and a lonely son who never really ruled anything. Again, not short, just tragic. Now let's drift over to his reign. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804. Literally crowned himself. The Pope was there, but Napoleon grabbed the crown and put it on his own head. Because if you want to scream, "I have no issues with insecurity," that's how you do it. He reformed French law, created the Napoleonic Code, reorganized education, and left behind systems that still shape Europe today. But people don't remember him for his bureaucratic genius. They remember him for war.
Napoleon was everywhere. Italy, Egypt, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Russia. He moved faster than his enemies expected, made daring decisions, and used artillery like it was his favorite toy. For a while, it worked. Europe bowed to him. Kings and queens married off daughters just to avoid getting crushed. But eventually, the overreach set in. Spain turned into a nightmare of guerrilla warfare. Russia became an icy graveyard. The British Navy never stopped being annoying. And by 1815, Napoleon was defeated for good at Waterloo. Cue the ABBA song. Exiled to St. Helena, a rocky island in the middle of nowhere, Napoleon spent his last years dictating memoirs, complaining about the British, and gaining weight. He died in 1821, possibly of stomach cancer, though conspiracy theories about poisoning still float around.
So, back to the original question. Was Napoleon short? No, he was average height. What made him seem small was propaganda, tall guards, and his larger-than-life personality crammed into a small frame. But honestly, his height matters less than the legend it created. Because once you reduce a world-conquering emperor to a short man joke, it sticks forever. And that's where we'll pause for now. We've set the stage, Napoleon, the not-so-short emperor. Next, we'll sink further into the world of other royals, whose bodies, bloodlines, and bizarre family choices made history a very weird place. Let's drift there, slowly. Hey guys, still awake? If you are, don't worry, we can fix that. Tonight, we're floating away from France and into Spain. Specifically to the very end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, where we find one of history's most tragic and unintentionally comedic monarchs, Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles was not called the Handsome. He was called the Bewitched, which is medieval PR code for we don't really know what's wrong with him, but it's a lot. This is a story about what happens when you take centuries of royal inbreeding, stir it up in a gene pool smaller than a kiddie bathtub, and then expect the resulting human being to successfully run an empire. Spoiler, it doesn't go well. So let's dim the lanterns a little lower and get cozy with the last Habsburg king of Spain. The Habsburgs were already famous for their look. You know the one. Long jaw, drooping lip, slightly confused expression. It was so distinctive that artists couldn't even flatter it away in portraits. It was the family brand. You looked at a painting and thought, ah, yes, another Habsburg jaw. Must be Tuesday. This came from generations of marrying cousins, uncles, nieces, you name it. The Spanish branch took this hobby very seriously. By the time Charles II came along, his family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tightly braided pretzel. Charles was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Now, here's where the genetics get fun. His father, Philip, was both Charles's dad and his great-uncle. His mother, Mariana, was his niece. Basically, Charles's parents were related in about 3 different ways, and if you tried to diagram it, your family tree software probably would crash. The result? Charles was physically frail, mentally delayed, and constantly sick. He didn't learn to talk until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. He had seizures, digestive issues, and was described as having only 1 working testicle. He was, in short, the human embodiment of centuries of keeping it in the family. But don't worry, Charles became king at age 4, because of course he did. His father died when he was little, and his mother became regent. So Spain was ruled by a woman who spent most of her time arguing with court factions, while her sickly son was paraded around as a symbol of continuity. Now, if you're imagining a child king growing into a strong adult ruler, let me stop you. Charles never really grew into his role. He remained frail and dependent all his life. Courtiers described him as having trouble chewing food, difficulty producing heirs, and being obsessed with exorcisms because he thought demons were the reason for his health problems. To be fair, when you're that inbred, demons do start to sound like the logical explanation. Let's drift into his adult life. Charles married twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess who basically cried for years because her new husband was physically incapable of, let's say, fulfilling his marital duties. She died young, officially of an illness, but everyone whispered that she had wasted away from despair. Charles remarried, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess who was chosen because her family was famously fertile, which is one way to describe them. Unfortunately, Charles and Maria Anna never produced a child either, which left the Spanish throne without an heir, setting up a massive succession crisis. But we're not here for the politics. We're here for the weird details, like how Charles reportedly couldn't swallow food without it coming back up, or how he believed he was cursed and his court actually ordered an exorcism. Imagine being emperor of a vast empire, and your solution to life's problems is, "Bring me more priests with holy water." The sad thing is, Charles wasn't stupid. Contemporary accounts say he tried. He attended councils, he listened to ministers, he cared about his people in his own way, but his body and mind simply weren't up to the task. It's like giving someone Windows 95 and expecting them to run modern software. The hardware just couldn't handle it. As his health declined, the empire declined with him. Spain lost wars, lost territories, and slid deeper into debt. By the time Charles died in 1700, the once great Spanish Habsburg line had sputtered out. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, which basically set Europe on fire for the next decade. So, in a way, Charles's jawline and infertility changed the balance of power in Europe, which is one of those weird ironies. The most fragile king produced the biggest chaos.
Let's pause for a sleepy thought. The myth about Napoleon being short was funny propaganda. But Charles II of Spain, that was reality. He was short, sickly, jaw-heavy, infertile, epileptic, and obsessed with demons. And yet he was king of one of the largest empires on earth. That's the thing about history's elites. Sometimes the people at the top of the pyramid are the least physically equipped to handle it, but the system props them up anyway, because bloodlines matter more than competence. And the results are, well, a little potato-shaped. Charles's legacy? He's remembered as the last Habsburg of Spain. He's also a textbook case in why genetic diversity is important. His genetic coefficient, the measure scientists use to calculate how closely related your parents are, was higher than if your parents were brother and sister, which is not great. So the next time someone brags about pure bloodlines, just remember Charles II, the man who proved that maybe mixing things up once in a while is a good idea. And with that, let's drift onward. From the bewitched King of Spain, we'll float next into another royal disaster,
because Europe wasn't short on them. In fact, if you were royal, it was practically your job to be dysfunctional. So tuck in a little deeper. Up next, more spoiled princes, sickly queens, and dynasties that should have maybe just married outside the family once in a while. Hey guys, still cozy? Still awake enough to hear about another royal family disaster? Tonight we're drifting into Russia at the turn of the 20th century, a place of snow, palaces, endless ceremonies, and unfortunately, bad genetics. This is the story of Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, heir to the Russian throne, son of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, a boy so important and yet so fragile that his condition ended up pulling a wandering mystic into the heart of the royal court. Yes, we're talking about the infamous Rasputin. But we'll get there slowly. Let's start with Alexei himself.
Alexei was born in 1904, the long-awaited son of the last Romanov Tsar. His parents had already produced 4 daughters, which, while lovely, were not considered ideal in an empire obsessed with male succession. So when Alexei finally arrived, bells rang, cannons fired, and the empire celebrated like it had just won the lottery. But that celebration came with a catch. Alexei carried a hidden flaw in his blood. He had inherited hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevented his blood from clotting properly. The disease came down through his mother, Alexandra, who was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Britain. Victoria, bless her matchmaking soul, had passed the royal disease into half the courts of Europe. Thanks, Grandma. For Alexei, this meant that even the smallest injury, a bruise, a cut, a stumble, could turn into a life-threatening crisis. His joints would swell with internal bleeding. He would scream in agony, feverish, helpless. His parents lived in constant terror that their only son, the heir to the empire, might bleed to death from something as small as falling off a chair. Now, picture the atmosphere in the Romanov household. You have the Tsar, Nicholas II, a man not exactly known for decisive leadership, and the Tsarina, Alexandra, who was deeply religious, deeply anxious, and extremely protective. Together, they wrapped Alexei in layers of secrecy. His illness was hidden from the public. They didn't want the empire to know that the future Tsar might not survive childhood. So, Alexei grew up surrounded by silence, overprotection, and a kind of doom hanging over him. He wasn't allowed to ride horses or play rough with other boys. He lived in a bubble of palaces, tutors, and worried glances, which, for a child, is not exactly the recipe for a carefree childhood. He did have moments of happiness. He adored his sisters, the 4 Grand Duchesses, who doted on him endlessly. He loved boats, playing with soldiers, and the occasional chance to sneak out of supervision. But every game carried risk, and every injury was followed by panic. And here's where Rasputin enters. Yes, that Rasputin, the bearded holy man, mystic, rumored hypnotist, lover, healer, and general walking scandal of Imperial Russia. Alexandra believed that Rasputin had a special power to help Alexei. When doctors failed, Rasputin prayed, whispered, or just sat by the boy's bedside, and miraculously, Alexei's pain would ease. Modern historians think Rasputin's miracles might have been due to something as simple as telling Alexandra to stop giving the boy aspirin, which, fun fact, makes hemophilia worse. But in the eyes of Alexandra, Rasputin was sent by God to save her son.
This created a royal dependency. Every time Alexei fell ill, and there were many times, Rasputin was summoned. His presence reassured Alexandra, calmed the boy, and gave the illusion of hope. And the more influence Rasputin gained in the family, the more scandal it caused in the empire. People whispered about his closeness to the empress. They mocked his drunkenness, his womanizing, his miracle reputation. Rasputin became the lightning rod for everything people disliked about the Romanovs, all because of a little boy who couldn't stop bleeding.
Alexei himself, he was described as intelligent, sometimes mischievous, and surprisingly tough in spirit. He knew he was fragile, but he longed for adventure. He once told his tutor that he wanted to become a sailor, which, given his condition, was about as realistic as becoming a tightrope walker. Still, the dream was there. His illness, however, shaped his personality. He could be irritable, spoiled, demanding, understandably, considering his constant pain. But he also developed a sense of fatalism. He reportedly once said, "When I am dead, it will not matter how I suffered," which is not exactly the light-hearted quote you want from a 12-year-old. The tragic part of Alexei's story is that his illness not only shaped his life, but indirectly helped doom his entire family. Because Alexandra's obsession with protecting him gave Rasputin his power, and Rasputin's scandals undermined faith in the monarchy at a time when Russia was already crumbling from war, poverty, and revolution. In other words, Alexei's blood disease bled straight into politics. By 1917, the empire collapsed. The Romanovs were placed under house arrest after Nicholas abdicated. Alexei, already weakened by years of illness, endured captivity with his family. Accounts say he remained devoted to his father, clung to his mother, and still had flashes of boyish energy with his sisters. But he also suffered from painful attacks, leaving him bedridden for long stretches. And then came 1918, the execution in Yekaterinburg. We won't linger on the details, they're too sharp for a bedtime story, but suffice it to say, Alexei's fragile body and royal name met the same fate as his entire family. He was only 13. So what do we take from this? Alexei Romanov was not short, like Napoleon was accused of being. He was not potato-shaped, like Charles II of Spain. He was simply too fragile for the brutal world of Russian politics. His existence, his illness, and his dependence on a shady mystic helped unravel an empire. He remains one of history's saddest royal children, born into unimaginable luxury, but unable to run, play, or grow freely. Destined to inherit a throne, but never given the chance to sit on it. Let's float back a little. Napoleon's height myth shows how propaganda twists perception. Charles II shows how inbreeding can sabotage a dynasty. Alexei shows how one child's illness can destabilize an empire. Different stories, same theme. Power and fragility live side by side in royal history. And with that, let's drift further. Next, we'll wander back into Britain, where another monarch, George III, earned a reputation not for his height or his jawline, but for his mind slowly unraveling. Yes, the so-called Mad King, another royal bedtime tale. So, take a sip of tea, settle deeper into the blankets, and let's prepare for more softly disastrous royals.
So, by now we've walked through the measurements, the uniforms, the shoes, the translators, and even the gossip columns. Napoleon's height has already been stretched, shrunk, and resized more than a bad JPEG. But somehow, the myth didn't just survive the 19th century. It thrived. And now we get to drift into the lazy river of how a man's height, or at least the world's collective misreading of it, managed to outlive him by centuries. Let's begin with one simple truth. Napoleon had an image problem. And not just the whole exiled twice, lost a war against basically everyone kind of problem. No, his enemies wanted to brand him as ridiculous, not just dangerous. You see, it's one thing to fear a conqueror. It's another thing entirely to laugh at him. Laughter makes dictators smaller, figuratively, literally, and sometimes both. British cartoonists in particular were gleeful. Think of them as the meme lords of the 1800s, only instead of Photoshop and Twitter, they had ink, paper, and entire publishing houses devoted to lampooning public figures. And Napoleon was their ultimate content machine. Caricatures showed him tiny, barely taller than his own boots, stomping around in a temper tantrum. And remember, Britain had fought him on and off for years. By painting him as laughably short, they didn't just mock him, they shrunk his aura of danger. It's the 19th century equivalent of turning a terrifying villain into a Saturday morning cartoon character. And once an image like that circulates, it sticks. People don't question it, they just repeat it. But here's the kicker. Even Napoleon himself at times leaned into the short man image. Why? Because being underestimated can be useful. If people think you're a harmless little guy, you can catch them off guard. Not that Napoleon was exactly hiding. He literally crowned himself emperor. But he knew that myths once set in motion could be manipulated. He was a master of image, after all. He curated portraits where he looked noble, statues that made him godlike, and propaganda that made him larger than life. If the British wanted to paint him as pocket-sized, fine. He would respond by making himself appear mythically huge elsewhere. It became a weird tug-of-war over his proportions. And yet, when you fast forward to modern times, the short Napoleon myth has only grown stronger. Why? Because it's funny. People love a simple, ironic twist. World conqueror, but short. It's a neat, bite-sized punchline. No pun intended. It's easier to repeat than world conqueror who was actually 5'6", which was average for the time. That doesn't roll off the tongue at parties. It also doesn't hurt that psychologists later coined the phrase Napoleon Complex. You know, the stereotype that short men overcompensate by being aggressive or ambitious. Was this actually true of Napoleon? Not really. He was ambitious, yes, aggressive, absolutely. But plenty of tall rulers fit that description too. Yet because his height was misreported, the label stuck. Now every time a guy under 5'8" buys a sports car, someone inevitably mutters, Napoleon Complex. Poor Napoleon. Mismeasured, mistranslated, and now immortalized as the poster child for short guy rage.
Let's drift a little further into the cultural afterlife. Literature, theater, films, all of them have had their say. From early stage plays that portrayed him as a comically small tyrant to Hollywood movies that sometimes cast actors nowhere near his real build, Napoleon's body has been reinterpreted endlessly. Sometimes he's tall and imposing, sometimes pint-sized and ridiculous. The truth never mattered as much as the story people wanted to tell. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here. History often remembers not what was, but what was most entertaining. A complex reality shrinks into a cartoon myth. And myths, once they start rolling, are almost impossible to stop. Napoleon the man has been gone since 1821. Napoleon the short guy meme, still very much alive. So was he short?
No, not really. Was he average for his time? Yes. Was he still doomed to centuries of jokes about needing a step stool to sit on his throne? Also yes, because once your enemies brand you, sometimes the brand wins. And on that sleepy thought, let's float onward to one more angle, the personal side. The way Napoleon himself actually carried his body, his presence, his aura, and how the people closest to him described it. Spoiler, they didn't exactly think of him as a small man at all. All right, we've wrestled with numbers, laughed at cartoons, and watched history squish Napoleon down to Funko Pop size. But let's take a step back and ask, what did people who actually met Napoleon say about him? Because paper myths are one thing, real human presence is another. First, his soldiers, the men who marched with him across Europe through snow, mud, and endless battles, didn't exactly describe a tiny figure struggling to be heard. Quite the opposite. They called him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. Cute nickname, right? But here's the thing. It wasn't about height, it was about affection. The name meant he was one of them, a leader who ate, slept, and fought alongside his troops instead of just barking orders from a golden chair. When veterans reminisced, they didn't say, "Oh, our emperor was small." They said, "When he entered the campfire circle, every head turned." Then there's the testimony of those who faced him off the battlefield. Diplomats, opponents, even enemies admitted he had an aura that filled the room. One described his gaze as piercing, impossible to ignore. Another noted that he carried himself with such authority that people felt shorter next to him, regardless of their actual height. That's presence. You can't measure it in feet and inches. Now, let's not skip over his personal life. Josephine, his first wife, never complained about him being small. If anything, she described him as passionate, magnetic, overwhelming, sometimes in ways that exhausted her. Later companions said the same. Napoleon wasn't physically huge, but he never faded into the background. He was restless, commanding, impossible to ignore. Even hostile observers admitted as much. One British officer, after seeing Napoleon in captivity on St. Helena, noted that while he wasn't especially tall, he seemed taller than he was. And that's the point. His presence projected upward, making him larger than his frame. This is where we realize something quietly funny. The obsession with Napoleon's height says more about us than it does about him. We, centuries later, are still measuring him with a tape measure, while his contemporaries measured him in charisma, authority, and energy. For the people who actually stood in front of him, height wasn't the first, second, or even 10th thing they remembered. Because here's the truth. You don't march millions of men across Europe, crown yourself emperor, and shake the entire political order of the continent by being small. You do it by being larger than life, on and off the battlefield. And Napoleon, whether standing at 5'6", 5'7", or whatever exact number you prefer, was absolutely that. So maybe the real story isn't that Napoleon was short, it's that he cast such a long shadow, the world had to invent a joke just to cut him down to size.
So here we are. We've crunched the numbers, peeked at old paintings, and even eavesdropped on Napoleon's soldiers and enemies. Verdict? The guy wasn't short. Average for his time, maybe even slightly taller. End of story, right? Not quite. Because if the myth of Napoleon the short general is so obviously false, why has it lasted over 200 years? Why is it still alive in memes, cartoons, and even our casual jokes? The answer
is simple. Stories outlive facts. Think about it. The image of a tiny man raging his way across Europe is funny, memorable, and easy to spread. It makes Napoleon more human, almost cartoonish. Instead of a genius strategist who terrified kings and redrew the map of Europe, he becomes a punchline. And who doesn't love a punchline? Especially if you're Britain in the 1800s, desperately trying to make your biggest enemy look ridiculous. British cartoonists like James Gilray didn't just sketch Napoleon as short for accuracy, they exaggerated it for comedy. They wanted audiences to laugh, not measure. And once that idea stuck, it snowballed. Newspapers repeated it, school books simplified it, pop culture cemented it. Even psychology piled on. In the 20th century, we invented the term Napoleon Complex, the idea that short men overcompensate with aggression. Was it scientifically solid? Not really, but the name fit too perfectly to resist. So Napoleon got blamed for a theory he never signed up for. And here's the kicker. The myth survived, not because it was true, but because it was useful. It gave enemies a weapon, teachers a funny hook, comedians a gag, and everyday people a simple way to explain a complicated man. Truth is messy. Myths are sticky. So the next time someone cracks a joke about Napoleon being small, remember this. History isn't just about what happened. It's about the stories we choose to keep alive. And sometimes those stories shrink giants down to size, not because they were small, but because they were too big to ignore.
Napoleon wasn't short, but the myth about him, that might just be the tallest story in history.